Flogging, the lash, the quintessential form of corporal punishment of the English-speaking world, and still popular in many locations once touched by the hand of British influence. While Malaysians still go at it with gusto, in Britain, the country that gave Malaysia the basis of its criminal code, flogging has completely gone out of favour, as it has throughout the entire Western world. Corporal punishment is now typically seen by Westerners as a backwards, atavistic, primitive practice, used only by semi-savage states and theocracies. All the fashionable, modern states instead lock their criminals away in prisons. None more spectacularly so than America, which in both proportional and absolute terms has more incarcerated people than any other country on Earth. What if I told you that mass incarceration, far from being an advanced, cultured, well-reasoned policy, was in fact a deranged habit built originally upon false premises that few now can even elucidate? Prison continues as our primary form of punishment, largely because all the potential alternatives, besides monetary fines, have been eliminated and denigrated one by one. Perhaps it is true that somewhere along the history of Western penal policy, we got it all wrong, and the flogging was actually better than prison in multiple key respects. Let's find out how this could have happened by looking at the origins and rationale of prisons and the problems they cause, followed by a brief introduction to the history of English flogging, before finally evaluating how flogging could possibly be an improvement over prisons. First, let's be clear about terms. Corporal punishment is any legal punishment that attacks the body, i.e. corporeally hurts an offender. Flogging is the use of some implement, a whip, a switch, or a cane, to attack the back or behind of an offender. History provides us with countless forms of corporal punishment besides flogging, many of which are truly horrific and make flogging look like a very pleasant occasion by comparison. In this video, I am specifically talking about flogging. Consider for a moment what it is we are looking for in a punishment. There are broadly three rationales for legal punishments. The first is justice, that is, giving people, victim, criminal, and society at large, what they deserve. Secondly, there is deterrence, convincing the same criminal and future potential criminals that committing crimes, committing offenses against society doesn't pay through the horror of the punishment itself. For much of human history, these two rationales were considered sufficient, but thanks to the Italian Enlightenment philosopher Cesare Beccaria and his intellectual successors, we have added a third, rehabilitation, reforming the criminal and turning him into a useful member of society. Rehabilitation and imprisonment, as we now know them, were essentially born together. Keep the offenders confined where you can control every aspect of their lives, so you can reform them through the means of psychological science and/or religion. Within the English-speaking world, the leading intellectual advocate of this idea was Jeremy Bentham, whose panopticon, an architectural monster of surveillance and control, was the inspiration for modern prisons. In Bentham's dream, the prison is a circular, multi-story building with each cell looking inwards. In the center of the building would be a warden's viewing platform, where the warden would have full view of the prisoners at all times. The warden's platform would be darkened so that prisoners would be unsure where the warden was looking at any given time. During the course of the 19th century, the ideas of Beccaria and Bentham would go mainstream, and prison as we know it came into existence. Prisons did exist before this time, such as debtors' prisons, but there was usually no attempt at the minute control of daily life that is now fundamental to the prison experience. They typically involved the free mingling of offenders, often both genders together, with unlimited visits from friends and family. This is not to say that pre-modern prisons were necessarily nice, but both their form and function were wildly different from today's prisons. Specific conditions and requirements varied, but one general phenomenon throughout history was the rarity of prisons. Prisons have always been expensive and thus historically not popular with states that feel they have better things to spend money on than food and shelter for criminals. More on the cost of prisons later. So, do prisons satisfy the three rationales for punishment that we have already mentioned? Are they just? Do they deter? Do they rehabilitate? Starting with the latter, the recidivism rates of modern criminals are notoriously bad. A whopping 50% of US criminals end up being re-imprisoned within 3 years of release. A great many criminals in our prison-heavy societies are clearly not being rehabilitated. No doubt, one could argue that this stems from factors independent of the form of punishment, such as work and educational opportunities for offenders, and the difficulty of explaining criminal records to employers. Perhaps that all has a role, but remember that Bentham, Beccaria, and the men who implemented their ideas chose prison precisely because of its imagined capacity for reform. With close to 2 centuries of trying, we haven't made it work that way. Do prisons deter crime? Over the period of Western mass incarceration and from country to country, crime rates have fluctuated enormously. Peter Hitchens, in A Brief History of Crime, explains how crime is lowered not by punishments, but by active police forces preventing crime taking place. Simon Webb, i.e. YouTube's History Debunked, makes a similar point in his book Execution. He details the various brutal and creative forms of death penalty used throughout British history, including beheading, stoning, hand-drawn and quartering, and culminating with the large-scale hanging of the 18th century. All these methods were anticipated to deter crime through their harshness. In all cases, they failed to do so. This is despite the fact that these punishments were almost always public. Enormous crowds thronged to see hangings. Great morbid excitement was generated by the last woman publicly burnt alive in London in the 1780s. To no effect, crime in Britain would drop greatly in the generations after these brutal punishments were discontinued. If the idea of being hanged, drawn, and quartered won't put you off crime, the threat of prison is unlikely to do it. The problem seems to be fundamentally psychological. Many crimes are committed out of impulse, often by less intelligent people who don't fully anticipate the consequences of their actions. Even your more intelligent class of criminal seems to struggle to imagine themselves in the worst scenarios the state can offer them, whether this is hanging or imprisonment or being flayed alive. So for the purpose of this discussion, I'm giving up on deterrence entirely. Now, what of justice? It strikes me that this is the least well appreciated rationale for punishment in modern times. At least it is very rarely used as an explicit justification by authorities, who find it easier to be tough on the causes of crime, by which they mean engage in social engineering. A punishment should only be considered just when the people involved get what they deserved. This refers not only to the criminal, but to the victim and to the state also. By effectively subtracting years from a person's life, prisons can be seen as quite harsh in their way. Imagine losing 5 years of your life, in particular 5 years of your youth or middle age when you're still in your prime. Even with the famous comforts of Norwegian prison, with video games and reading, that's 5 years taken from developing your real life. Years that could have gone into work, family, hobbies, or education, all things that give modern life meaning. I am also impressed by the arguments in the book Flogging Others that a prison sentence does in fact have features of corporal punishment. Limited access to nutrition and healthcare, and being in an unhealthy environment with sometimes violent people does have a corporeal effect. It harms your body. You suffer both physical and mental damage, often quite terribly. I'm not doubting then that prison is in some sense very harsh. But harshness by itself isn't justice. You have to get what you deserve. And what strikes me about prison in this respect is its unevenness. It's uneven because the actual experience of prison can vary considerably. Consider prison violence, which can notoriously be of a sexual nature. In the United States, 1 in 20 prisoners claims to have been sexually assaulted. We might laugh this off. Good riddance to these criminals. But not all criminals are equal. Ask yourself what type of criminal deserves sexual assault as a punishment. Perhaps you can think of some, but most? And consider this. What if the criminal who harmed you was not the victim of prison sexual assault, but its perpetrator? This criminal is punished how exactly? By being provided with more victims? Is that what he deserves? More importantly, is that what you deserve? Too often, we forget that justice isn't just for the offender. It is for the individual and the society that the offender has acted against. You deserve to know that the offender has been punished, that it is he and not you who can be deliberately harmed. Society deserves the opportunity to demonstrate its strength and solidarity against harmful members. How can prison provide this satisfactorily when there is so much mystery about the actual experience of an individual offender? He goes off to prison, and as far as society at large knows, he has entered a black box, only if he is a famous case where we get snippets of details about his prison life. Generally, we have no idea if he is beaten and abused, which he probably doesn't deserve necessarily, or is himself the perpetrator of such acts against less vicious inmates. Now let's turn to flogging. While seen as an ancient and medieval punishment, flogging was in fact not especially typical of pre-modern cultures, whether European or otherwise. England's Alfred the Great prescribed monetary fines for virtually all crimes, including the murder of high-ranking members of society. When the British in colonial Australia wanted to demonstrate their justice to the Aboriginals, they invited them to witness the flogging of an English convict who had attacked them. But the Aboriginals were horrified. Such a punishment was as bizarre to them as it would have been to Alfred the Great. Medieval Europe experimented with a vast array of punishments, some scarier than others. Exile, burnings, beheadings, public humiliation in stocks, bodily mutilation, such as the slicing off of the offender's nose or ears, branding with hot irons, and yes, sometimes flogging. Flogging would be better seen as an early modern or indeed Renaissance punishment. For England, the growth of flogging began with Henry VIII's straightforwardly named Whipping Act of 1530, which specified flogging as the punishment for a much greater variety of crimes than previously. It would remain a punishment in England until the Criminal Justice Act of 1948, though its use started declining significantly from the 1860s. 1530 to 1860 gives us just over 300 years that we can call the glory days of the English flogging. Incidentally, this coincided with our Industrial Revolution and massive expansion of the British Empire. I'm not saying these things are intrinsically entwined, but it's an interesting fact to note. Flogging in British history belongs with the Enlightenment, industry, parliamentary government, and global commerce, not medieval despotism or ancient barbarism. Mass incarceration, by contrast, is the preferred punishment of a weak, barely independent nation that hardly knows itself anymore. During these years, these glory days of flogging, other forms of corporal punishment were gradually phased out, and flogging was king. Why? The other forms of historical corporal punishment in England had some severe disadvantages when compared to flogging. The logic of slicing off a nose or ear or scourging the flesh with a hot iron to mark the letter T, standing for thief, was to mark this person permanently as a criminal. Doing so, though, surely makes it much harder for that person to be reintegrated into society. Flogging is applied to the back, buttocks, or legs, and thus the criminal can later remain covered up and continue a new and hopefully honest and productive life after their punishment. The stocks had their own problems. Criminals were held in place and exposed to the abuse of the general public. In the popular imagination, we see these criminals pelted with mud, rotten vegetables, and feces. So far, so bad. But what if the locals prefer to throw stones? There were cases of criminals in stocks being stoned to death. A corporal sentence meant to shame and humiliate thus became a capital punishment, according to the whims of passers-by. Such an uneven punishment must be considered unjust and brings the law into disrepute. Now let's examine why flogging may indeed be a good form of punishment. Good understood in the sense of providing society an effective instrument of justice, plus some consideration for secondary benefits, such as possible rehabilitation. Specifically, I want to propose flogging as an alternative to prison for some types of criminals. This is markedly different to the example of Malaysia and Singapore, where flogging with a cane is conducted in addition to a prison sentence. I believe sentencing a criminal to both punishments actually undermines some of the benefits of flogging, which I will explain shortly. Where Malaysia and Singapore get it absolutely right is that a criminal always receives a thorough health check before the flogging to ensure they are fit enough to sustain it, and the punishment is always inflicted by a highly trained professional. In these respects, Malaysia and Singapore set a useful example of what modern flogging could look like in the West. How does flogging stand up as a form of justice? From the point of view of the victim and wider society, with flogging you are guaranteed a clear punishment. There will be absolutely no question that the criminal will suffer. The pain and bodily damage are explicit and easily understood by everyone. This element can be enhanced by allowing victims to be present at the flogging, just as the relatives of murder victims are sometimes present at executions in the United States. This punishment can be meted out with equality and equity. As we've discussed, there is little way to measure or even control the precise sufferings of incarcerated prisoners. Prison inmates suffer unevenly. The more brutish may find some pleasures from prison through the abuse of others, while weaker prisoners suffer more. This is unjust because it is uneven. The flogged criminal, though, has his punishment exactly measured out. The number of lashes can be determined by the letter of the law and the sentencing judge. The worse the criminal, the more lashes can be prescribed. So there's no question of what everyone, including the victim, is getting out of the justice system. Now let's consider rehabilitation. As mentioned already, rehabilitation was a latecomer to justifications for punishment. Prison was supposed to provide individual reformation, but it failed to do so. How does flogging fare? Now obviously, flogging cannot impart ethics, conscientiousness, or job skills, which the advocates of prison sometimes imagined can be provided by incarceration. But it does prevent the criminal being taken away from any of those opportunities. If the criminal had a job and he goes to prison, the job is now lost. If he was in any kind of education, that's over. Any positive social connections he had are severed. Bentham envisioned actual reformation in the hearts of criminals. But to be peacefully integrated into society is the practical essence of successful rehabilitation. Flogging may not provide rehabilitation in of itself, at least it doesn't stand in the way of it by breaking all connections between the criminal and society at large. Now, you may say that many criminals have bad social connections, live in a criminal subculture, in some cases don't have jobs and aren't in any kind of education or job training. Certainly, in many cases that is true, but is it true in all cases? Well, of course not. But it's certainly the case that those criminals who did have those opportunities lose them by going to prison, at least temporarily and often for good. But it's certainly true that those criminals who did have those opportunities lose them by going to prison, at least temporarily, and often lose them for good. There is in fact a very nice historical example of how flogging can form part of a system of rehabilitation and reform, and that is Colonial Australia, which I have in fact discussed on this channel in other videos. In the popular imagination and in Australian historiography, the lash is given an infamous role. It is a symbol of all that was oppressive about the convict system, whereby Britain deported tens of thousands of its criminals to penal colonies in Australia between 1788 and 1868. About a third of convicts in Australia were flogged, and yet only about 10% of convicts were what we would now call unrehabilitated. 90%, the vast majority of convicts sent from Britain and Ireland to Australia, successfully transitioned from prisoner to useful member of society. They were able to do this because, flogged or not, they were never entirely cut off from regular life. The great majority of convicts worked in society. Many were assigned to private employers, working and living with these masters away from any daily official oversight at all. Other convicts were kept in government employment, but even in such cases, they usually had their own free time. They could wander the streets of Sydney at some leisure. They played sport, made friends, they even pursued and married women, all before completing their sentence. Yes, there were rules. They couldn't go anywhere they wanted, but there were no walls preventing escape. They weren't in a literal jail, rather it was flogging that was meant to keep them well behaved. Flogging for being out after curfew, or for being drunk in public, or refusing to work. No doubt, the threat of flogging itself was unpleasant, but compared to modern prisoners who have every aspect of their lives controlled, the convicts of Australia lived with great freedom. They lived as part of society, and so once they had completed their sentences, they were usually ready to start their new life as entirely free men. They knew who the employers were, they had friends and contacts, they sometimes had wives and businesses waiting for them. This all had a great rehabilitating effect. Former convicts would rise high, and the sons of convicts would rise to the very top of Australian society. For more details on convict life in Australia, you could see my video dedicated to the subject. The key point is that large-scale flogging didn't do any harm to rehabilitation of convicts in colonial Australia, while the social connections and integration with society allowed to convicts by the penal system there absolutely facilitated rehabilitation. It is this integration that prison breaks and prevents. Finally, let's examine some secondary, but still important, benefits of choosing flogging over imprisonment. I call them secondary not to diminish their significance, but because they are not fundamental penal objectives in the way justice and reintegration are. An obvious benefit of flogging over imprisonment, and a great reason why for thousands of years corporal punishment was preferred to incarceration, is that it is cheap. While with imprisonment, you must pay for the structure of prison itself, for the food and healthcare of the prisoner, the salaries of prison guards and other workers associated with the prison. With a flogging, we need only to pay the salary of the flagellant, the cost of the implement, a suitable location for the occasion, and a one-time health checkup and follow-up healthcare in the aftermath of the flogging. In the United Kingdom, we currently spend between £5 and £6 billion on prisons annually since 2020, and they are still overcrowded. Some of that money could be saved by choosing corporal punishment. Another criticism of prisons that would be avoided by flogging is that of the so-called criminal university. Criminals go to prison, sometimes for relatively minor offences, and meet with older and more experienced criminals. Indeed, their entire society in prison is that of criminals and guards. It's rather remarkable, actually, that men like Bentham and Beccaria imagined such company would be reforming. The growth of prison gangs in the United States and the United Kingdom is the fruit of putting large numbers of criminals together without any way of having them integrated into normal society. Flogging would reduce this problem by punishing the criminal without removing them from normal society. So, having looked at the advantages of flogging as a punishment, I want to propose something like this. Some categories of criminals should be flogged and not sent to prison. But prisons should be kept for more dangerous varieties of criminal. In particular, flogging should be reserved for those criminals who are non-violent or criminals whose violence can be reasonably seen stemming from particular circumstances of the moment and not a general behavior. Some criminals are so dangerous and violent that they can't be allowed to roam the streets, whether they've been flogged or not. Prison should be for these criminals, people whose society shouldn't have to be worrying about on a daily basis. I personally doubt most criminals fall into this class, but I leave it up to the astute listener and to future lawmakers to work out exactly where this line should be drawn. The number of lashes to be applied to the criminal should be commensurate with the crime and be specified exactly by the judge, just as they now specify terms of imprisonment. As is done in modern Singapore and Malaysia, the subjects of flogging should be checked by doctors before undergoing the sentence to ensure they are physically fit enough to survive it. If they are not, then it will have to be prison in lieu of flogging. This will benefit society in a number of ways. Criminals who are not in immediate danger and have the potential to become, or indeed already are, useful members of society shall not be prevented from being such. Some form of reintegration of the criminal will be possible, if not guaranteed. Money will be saved, and some of the worst problems of prison, such as prison gangs and prison violence, will be reduced, if not completely avoided. But most fundamentally, justice will be unequivocal, clear, and applied evenly. You, if a victim of crime, will be in no doubt that the state has looked out for your interests by punishing whoever has harmed you. To me, it seems a fundamentally more honest punishment than the mystery box of prison. For all that I have said, you may be simply too repulsed by flogging to see it as worth consideration. It is too brutal, too cruel, too archaic. I posit that in centuries to come, mass imprisonment will be seen as archaic. If you think the lash is too brutal, give a second to consider the fate of the victims of prison violence. Finally, ask yourself these two questions. First, if you were to be sentenced, would you rather be flogged or lose 5 years of your life to an uncertain time in prison, separated from your family and career? I personally can't imagine choosing the second option. Secondly, if you had been harmed by a criminal, would you not rather be certain of and see, perhaps in person, exactly how justice is served? For these reasons, I wish to suggest to you, my friends, viewers, and listeners, that the lash could well be what we need to whip our criminal code back into life. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you so much, everybody.